Ooh, sorry about the view. There we go. Alright, this is going to be a response to several comments I received on my video on the free rider problem. A YouTube user named the blitheringgenius has come on there and he's made several points that I'd like to respond to. Response in text, although I already tried, is very frustrating. So now I have cut and pasted many of his comments. I don't know if they're in order, so I apologize for that, but I will read them. So this is one of his comments. Consider this example of a life or death situation. Say you have an invasion of an organized coercive state into an area that is AC, anarcho-capitalist. An individual can have no effect on the invasion by acting alone. People in the AC region have the following options: fight or collaborate with the invaders. The incentive will be to collaborate, since without a coercive state there is no reason to expect others to fight. It is essentially the prisoner's dilemma. There are several assumptions in this argument that I think cannot be taken for granted. For one, you don't have the only options are not to collaborate or to fight the invaders. There is also the option to flee, which changes the dynamic somewhat. There is the option to do both. It is possible to oppose the invaders up to a point and then become collaborators, which, by the way, is fairly common. It is very common for an invading force to be resisted initially, and if it is defeated, that it retreats. On the other hand, if it looks to be like it's more likely to win, people will switch to become collaborators, an option that you don't have listed here. And the other is to either flee right away, or to flee at the point where you think that you no longer have any chances of winning. So that is a very simplistic, and there's probably other scenarios. You know, you could be completely neutral. You know, it's not necessarily the case that you need to actively oppose or actively support in any way either side in the conflict. And this also is very common. In fact, historically, in most wars before the modern era, I think the majority of the populace in society is going to fall into that category, which you don't even allow for in your example. So given the fact that there's actually more alternatives than the two that you list, is problematic for your analysis. Let's just start with that. Then another assumption: an individual can have no effect on the invasion by acting alone. No. An individual can have an effect. Now, is it likely in most circumstances that they can have a major effect? No, although if that individual, say, had atom bombs or controlled an important bridge or an important fort or anything like that, it is conceivable, and it has actually occurred, where individuals or very small groups of individuals can at the very least have a noticeable effect on an invasion, even if they can't necessarily defeat it entirely on their own. You know, a single soldier has zero chance of affecting the defeat of an, you know, we can have a state and a specific soldier can reasonably assume that their efforts will not defeat the enemy by themselves. And actually David D. Friedman gives a great example of what he calls a market failure, and that is you have a military unit that's supported by a state getting attacked, and the soldiers realize if they win, their individual contribution's not going to matter very much. If they run away, but if they lose, running away right away before they staying around for the slaughter makes the most sense. So they should all flee all right away, which in fact happens quite a bit. Not every battle or anything, but it's not, it's hardly a rare occurrence. But individuals can have an effect. Now, that's not to be all Hollywood and say an individual can necessarily hope to thwart the entire invasion single-handedly. Probably not, although, you know, in the right circumstances it's possible, even if highly improbable. But that's not a standard that anybody meets, whether they are in a state or not. You can have an effect. You can kill a few people, even today, you know, with a rifle. Even if you're totally overmatched, you can reasonably expect to take a few pot shots, do a little damage, to kill a few people. And that, however small you want to say that is, and again, it depends on the circumstances. If you're being invaded by millions and millions and millions of soldiers, killing one or two isn't much of an effect. If you're being invaded by 10,000, a couple that is, So I think that this assumption here is not warranted. The idea that there is no effect is singularly ahistoric. Now, the other problem here is it assumes that when you have a state that collaboration, there's a couple other assumptions here about your view of collaboration. One is that if you have a state, then collaboration can't happen. This is clearly false. Even when you have states, there's a lot of collaboration, and it depends very much on the circumstances. And the most important circumstances and variables don't appear to have anything to do with whether there's a state on the other side or not. During World War II, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, literally millions and millions of Soviets, including many Soviet soldiers, collaborated with the Germans, even though they had a state, and that state had a death penalty for anyone who did anything even remotely like that. They had a death penalty for stuff even several grades less treasonous than that. And yet, that did not prevent millions of people from collaborating. But although that's a huge example, it's not the only one. In fact, there are probably no wars for which we have any evidence that nobody from one side collaborated with the other. And so for you to assume, well, in an anarchist society, everyone would collaborate, or either collaborate or not fight, although you didn't give that as a possibility. But in states solve that problem, it's not true, because there's still collaboration with states. Now, there's another even more fundamental problem with the idea that collaboration is an invalidating principle when it comes to states, because it assumes several things. It assumes that the defending state is preferable to the attacking state. It also assumes that the effort of going to resisting the aggressing state is worth the effort. So you might, two scenarios, you're getting attacked, and the country that's attacking you, you think is actually a better country than the one that rules over you currently. In which case, collaboration is not evil or a sign of a market failure. Collaboration is rational, it makes sense, and it's not something to be condemned. You would have to take the ridiculous position that everybody in a society would be better off always with their current government and never with an aggressive government, or a government that's attacking them for one reason or another. When in any given scenario, it's unlikely that both states will be identical in their appeal to the populace. The defending one may be better, the attacking one may be worse. The other is that maybe you prefer the government you have, it is better than the attacking one, but the trials and tribulations of going to the effort of resisting them is not worth that effort. So you may not want, like, to use the same example as previously, you may be a Soviet, you may hate the Soviet government, you may hate the Nazi government as well, and you just look at it like, look, I'm not going to risk my life to try and keep Stalin on the throne. It's not worth it. Even if I'd rather live under Stalin than Hitler, I'd rather not go up against the Wehrmacht if that's the price I have to pay. Now, your argument assumes that that is categorically and always the wrong decision, and I don't think that can be the case. So, does collaboration hurt the defender's ability to defend? Yes, it does. Is that always wrong? No, it's not. And second, of course, the state does not prevent collaboration from occurring. There are several other possibilities that you ignore, and he then goes on to say that, let's see, I don't want to misquote him. He goes on here. If everyone else resists, you can free ride. If they don't resist, your best option is defection to the other side. Either way, resistance is not the best option. The only choice is between free riding and defection. Smart money is on defection. No, it's not the only choice. You can flee, You can fight even if you know you're going to lose. There are people who are willing to do that for whatever reason. Maybe they're religious reasons, maybe they're just personal reasons, maybe they're ignorant reasons where they don't realize the odds and they still fight, because they don't know them. People aren't always going to come to this. I mean, you have this idea that there's this calculus that's going to happen every single time, and it's not going to happen every single time, and when it does happen, it's not always going to reach the same conclusion. You can think all you want the prisoner's dilemma means that in a stateless society no one will resist and everyone will collaborate, but historically you are wrong, because there are examples, in fact quite a few, of states aggressing against, attacking stateless societies. And when they do this, it is actually unusual. I don't want to say it's never happened, because history is a long time, but it's very normally they meet resistance, violent resistance, not necessarily from every single person. That's true whether they attack a state or an anarchist society. Here's the thing: is even in a state like that has a death penalty for people who don't assist them, there will be people who do not assist the state in defense. And so you could say, oh well, yeah, that stateless society, maybe it resisted, but not everyone resisted. Well, not everyone's going to resist in a state either. But your argument is that no one will resist, and your argument's clearly false, because in anarchist societies people do resist, and sometimes quite effectively. And then you say, what stateless societies has actually resisted invasion by a state? Well, a modern example would be Afghanistan. The Taliban government was destroyed, and there's still resistance to the United States, as there was resistance against the Soviet Union after it invaded, even though the nominal Afghan government was on the side of the Soviets. When the English attacked the Americans in the Revolutionary War, the United States was not stateless at that point, although there wasn't a central state. There were 13 individual states, and yet somehow they managed to work together without there being a king. I mentioned the Mongols. Now, you said, oh, you don't think the Mongol Empire was a state. I didn't say the Mongol Empire wasn't a state. Mongols are mostly statists. Several times they have united to form a state, especially under Chinggis Khan, normally known as Genghis Khan in the West, and then later under the Zhugars. But most of the period from recorded Chinese history, which I'm talking probably 1000 BC and plus, they've been without a state most of that time. And the Chinese states that have come and gone, the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, the Qin Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, all of them have at one point or another attempted to assert themselves over the steppe, over the Mongols. And whether the Mongols had a state or not, sometimes they did, most of the times they didn't, they resisted, and they resisted very effectively. The Chinese states were not able to assert themselves into Inner Mongolia, onto the steppe, until the 18th century, which is probably 2,000-3,000 years of them attempting to do so. What I think is perhaps the best example is the conquistadors, especially Hernando Cortez in the New World. Mesoamerica at the time, you have both stateless societies and societies with states. You have large empires like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, some of the city-states in the Yucatan that are Mayan, but most of the rest of the continent, including within Central America, are stateless. They're tribes. They don't have anything. Any anthropologist who would look at them would say there's no state. There's no central coercive authority. There's no king. They might have chieftains, but they have a ceremonial position. They don't have the ability to coerce. They don't have executive power. They have persuasive ability. Now, the theory put forth here would be obvious. Obviously, the empires will be much better at resisting a Spanish attack. The Aztec had a huge army. They had hundreds of thousands of soldiers that they could rally. They were very centralized in the person of the emperor. Now, what's doubly interesting about this example is that the conquistadors were actually not state agents. They were private mercenaries. In fact, the kings of Spain King Ferdinand at that point, and then later Charles V with the Incas, did not even know that this was happening. They were not outfitted with tax money. They weren't ordered by the military. Cortez essentially went around Cuba and started signing people up as mercenaries. The idea being, you come, I'll be the commander, you do what I say, and in return you'll get a share of the booty. Actually, in the future, Cortez spent the rest of his life in litigation, basically, over people saying, I was owed this much. There are kind of apocryphal stories that he had all this gold that disappeared, and so many of the soldiers were like, hey, well, I'm old. This was not the governor of Cuba caught on to this expedition before it went off, and he tried to stop it, mostly because he wanted to do it himself, but he failed. They left without his knowledge. So, the conquistadors are private mercenaries. They're not even a state government. They attacked Mexico, which was the most powerful state in probably the Western Hemisphere. Maybe the Incas were more powerful, but they didn't really compete. But it was one of the two. Huge urban centers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a history of conquest and of war. And you also have lots of Native American tribes that are anarchists, that are much more primitive, even by the standards of the Aztec. And the prediction in who's going to win, who's going to fare better, especially if you're going to call correctly the conquistadors non-state agents, is the Aztecs are going to be better at defending themselves. And at the end of the day, that wasn't true. The Aztecs basically could not fight against the Spanish conquistadors. They tried, and not only could they not fight, but one of the main aids to the Spanish was the mass collaboration of subjects of the Aztec Empire, something that you seem to think a state prevents or makes much more difficult. The Spanish would not have been able to feed themselves or logistically do anything that they did if it had not been for the huge amount of support that they received from native enemies of the Aztec, especially the Tlaxcalans, but also from many people who had been subjugated and were citizens, or not citizens, but were subjects of the Aztec. Needless to say, it took about 18 months and that entire state was conquered. A few years later, Cortez decided to one-up, and conquer a new area, and you've never heard of it because he failed. He marched into Guatemala, an area that did not have a state. There was no great empire there. There were no city-states there. It was just anarchist tribes. And at this point, of course, Cortez had years of experience in America. He had many times more Spanish soldiers, many times more Native American soldiers. All the odds are in the favor of him being successful in his invasion of Guatemala, and he only got out of there with his life just barely. They limped back, and almost all of them were annihilated. And Guatemala continued. When I say Guatemala, I don't mean strictly within the borders of the modern nation state, but that region and other regions successfully resisted Spanish attempts to conquer them, which became status later. Eventually, of course, Mexico became New Spain, the viceroyalty of New Spain, and did have a government. And that government attempted to take over the rest of Central America. And many of these stateless societies were able to resist for centuries, whereas the Aztec and the Inca fell right away. And the same thing happened with the Inca. Pizarro had no trouble conquering, again, a vast state, highly centralized. The king of the Inca was as central to that society as was possible. And yet, when they tried to invade the jungles of Ecuador, the more Amazonian bases, which didn't have states, at least in that region, it didn't take. This is also similar to, say, North America. 100 years after the conquistadors, you have the English landing, and again, the English who landed in North America were not government soldiers either. They were companies, charter companies, the London Company, the Plymouth Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. These were investors in England, essentially sending company people over to the New World. So when they were interacting with the Native Americans in North America, and I don't know about the southeast, was a little bit more difficult, but in the northeast, the Algonquins people are uniformly anarchists. They did not have states. This is not a controversial claim. The anthropology, the experts on the area, all of them say no states there. The only exception is the Iroquois, and I say possible exception. Of course, the Iroquois are not Algonquin, that's why I'm able to say that. And the Iroquois Confederacy, even that is difficult to say that that's a state. It is an informal arrangement, an understanding between a language isolate. There's a culturally homogenous area. The Iroquois have one language. They're surrounded by a much larger culture. That's another, the Algonquins. Not really a state. No executive power. The leaders, so-called, of the Iroquois and of the Algonquin did not have executive power. They did not have coercive power. They persuaded people. And yet, these forces were very effective at resisting the English colonies. The Virginia colony was almost wiped out twice. Almost wiped out, which is much more than can be said for what happened to the conquistadors at the hands of the Aztec. The Aztec never almost wiped out the conquistadors. But then again, in New England, in King Philip's War, many colonies were wiped out, and the colonists at that point strictly had governments, were unable to respond. They were unable to fight the Indians, who again were not a government. And what eventually won the war was not states. It's when the governor of New York went to the Iroquois and said, "We can't really deal with this, you deal with it." And the Mohawk were able to basically annihilate the power base of King Philip. And King Philip is his name. It doesn't imply that he was actually a monarch, which he was not. He was an influential chief. People listened to him. And the other thing is, people were pissed off enough at the English that they were willing to fight rather than collaborate. And there, of course, that's 50 years after the founding of New England. There's a lot of time to learn to collaborate. But instead, they fought anyway. So you can say there's a prisoner's dilemma all you want, but pretty much every Native American tribe that ever resisted was anarchist. So it's completely false to say, well, there's a prisoner's dilemma which will then cause there to be no resistance. People resist all the time. Now, you could say, well, ultimately they failed. Well, it depends what you mean by failed. Many aggresses by the New Englanders or by the whites or by the Europeans were repulsed, and sometimes leading to decades or centuries more of the perpetuation of that society. It's hard to see how that, it's interesting. There's one group in Chile that fought for 300 years, and you could say, oh, they failed eventually. There is no states you can name that don't fail eventually. By that standard, the Roman Empire is a failure because eventually it fell to conquest. Sure, it won lots of battles and it defended itself for a long time, but eventually it failed to do so. So the Roman Empire is a failed society. States don't work, right? That logic doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, but that's the logic you're applying to anarchist societies. The other reasons is you're assuming that the failure of an anarchist society must be because it's anarchist. When let's think of an analogy here. Let's say space aliens that are anarchists invade the Earth right now, and they have, of course, vastly more superior technology. They have laser guns. They have force fields. All the sci-fi stuff that they have, and they defeat us. And then would you conclude that, well, the reason they defeated us is because they're anarchists and we have governments? Or would you say the reason that they defeated us is because they were technologically more advanced? That seems the much more plausible solution. When you analyze the battles between the anarchist natives, and this could be in the Americas, or this could be in Africa, or this could be in Asia. In Australia, they hardly ever fought, so maybe it couldn't be there, I guess. But the Europeans don't necessarily win. It's hard to see how they win because they have a centralized authority and they have hierarchy and whatever that's winning the battles. It's technological differences. When you have, but even then, many of the anarchist societies were effective at resisting. To the point, now when you have parity in technology, it's different. Now another example here of both of the military effectiveness of anarchist society with contemporary technology, there's several in Europe. The Vikings, for one. The Vikings did not start to really develop states until the 9th century. Prior to that, and in certain areas long after that, they were anarchist. This is kind of the fallacy. A lot of ANCAPs talk about Iceland, and it's true, Iceland was anarcho-capitalist for a long time. Well, it was never invaded, so it doesn't prove that much in that regard. What people miss is that Nordic society generally was anarchist up until right around the founding of Iceland, and then parts of it started to become more state-oriented. But what's interesting is before that even happened, the Vikings were effectively demolishing the states of Europe. The Heptarchy in the UK, most of them were completely unable to resist military aggression by Vikings who were themselves anarchists. The leaders of the Vikings weren't kings. They didn't have political power. They were chieftains. They were people who convinced others, hey, let's go on a raid. And in that situation, you don't have, well, the state wins and the anarchy loses. You have, in that situation, the anarchy is actually winning. And the Vikings conquered more than half of England. The Dane lands. And still today, many people in England have Viking surnames. Another example, two more examples in the British Isles, obviously the Irish. Anarchist society that resisted the English, again, for hundreds of years, and you can say, well, eventually they lost, and that's true, eventually they did. It's unclear that that had anything to do with them being anarchist. It's interesting, when the Normans, the conquest of Ireland was begun by the Normans. The Normans conquered England first, and of course, if you look at the British Isles in 1066, we have an Anglo-Saxon state in what is today England. Then you have essentially anarchist Brehon law in Ireland, and also anarchist Welsh population in Wales. And in Scotland you have anarchy in most places except for around what's today Edinburgh. That's where the state that eventually became the Scottish state was starting to grow at that point, but it only encompassed that one estuary at that point. So the Normans invade, and so theoretically, from the statist point of view, obviously then Wales and Ireland will be conquered right away, and Scotland will be conquered right away, and England, because it has, at that point, actually a fairly advanced, secure state, well, they'll be able to offer an effective resistance against the Normans. When, in fact, it was the English state that was conquered almost immediately in a day. Not a day if you count the marching or whatever, but in one battle, essentially. They win one battle, at the Battle of Hastings, and they become the new state, and they don't have to conquer the rest of England. Now, those same expansionist Normans look around, they decide they want to take Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And the thing is, they weren't able to do it. There's a good book called The Struggle for Mastery. It's about Plantagenet England. And it says, and this is not by an anarchist author, this isn't a book by Murray Rothbard or some other anarchist, this is just a straight up boring English historian. Yeah, one very telling line. In Wales, there could be no Hastings, because there was no state in Hastings. There's no, we win this battle, now we own the entire country. We fight in this one valley, if we win, we can rule those people by force, then we have to make the same battle in the next valley, and the next valley, across the next river. And the result is that Wales, 1066, when the Normans invade, obviously the Anglo-Saxon state had been attempting to do this even longer, and you don't get the full submission, or even a semblance of submission of Wales until the 1280s, and really not until the 1300s, so 300 years later. Much longer than the Anglo-Saxon state. Ireland, even longer. So again, you have contemporary types of technology. The states don't necessarily win all the time. Modern examples, Afghanistan, both against the Russians and the US. they still resist. I mean, your ideology, your claim is that the prisoner's dilemma means that they won't resist, and many of them don't. And there are lots of collaborators in Afghanistan, and many people resist as well. In fact, it's probably only a small group that actually resists. And yeah, that doesn't mean it's ineffective. That doesn't mean that it is incapable of achieving its ends. And we could go on and on and on and on, but I think that your claim that the prisoner's dilemma makes resistance, incentivizes against it to the point that it won't happen is clearly false. And when a society does fail, and it's interesting how, like, when an anarchist society fails, is conquered, that proves that anarchy can't work. But when a state is conquered, that doesn't prove anything. When states get conquered all the time. So, let's see. Blah, 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 blah. It says the payoff for not resisting is greater no matter what others do. Doesn't matter what social outcome you prefer, since your individual actions have no significant impact on social outcomes. Okay, so you've changed your wording slightly to no effect to no significant impact. I think this later wording makes more sense. However, this is true whether you're in a state or not. If you're in the military, the chances that your contribution has a significant impact on a social outcome is practically nil. In fact, as an agent of a bureaucracy, that's probably not. Now, there's other things too. You're assuming that if a state is resisting, that A, it should, that it's better that one state controls a certain area over another, and B, that the use of its coercion is going to be for the common good and not something else, which is not necessarily the case. In fact, it's never the case. The use of that coercive authority is always the perpetuation of that coercive authority, not some Benthamite idea of what's best for everybody. The other thing is they make huge mistakes too. There's the potential that the state can squander all those resources it has acquired through coercion and actually make the place less defensible. And this has happened plenty of times. All the examples I've given and many more. Another example would be the Franco-Prussian War. Obviously France was not anarchist. I don't make no claim to that effect. The French military was essentially defeated right at the outset of that battle. They basically took refuge in the fortress of Metz, which was besieged, and after a few months they had to surrender. That was the bulk of the French army. A couple other battles destroyed the rest. And yet the Germans almost lost that war because regular Frenchmen took their own initiative to begin resisting the Germans by taking pot shots at them, by blowing up bridges, by blowing up supplies. And of course, your theory is that this is impossible, that they'll just collaborate. There was no French state that could plausibly prevent them from collaborating. The people who did collaborate were not punished in any major way. And yet, the latter resistance effort was much more effective against the Prussian military than was the states. Bismarck almost had a mental breakdown. The cost of just keeping the army deployed in France grew to such enormous amounts that they were thinking that they would have to withdraw, even though they had essentially won the war. And what actually ended the resistance? Was it because the state army crushed the people taking their own initiative? No, it was that the government of France surrendered. So you can, and that's hardly unusual. When people perceive an attack, because let's take two scenarios that I think between the two of them kind of cover all the possibilities of attacking the state. Scenario one, the attacking state, for all intents and purposes, isn't that bad compared to what you already have. You look at that state and you either see a better state than the one you live under now, or one that's no worse. From that point of view, and that's a legitimate point of view much of the time, unless you disagree, resisting that state doesn't make any sense, and it's not a market failure or a mark against society if you don't do that. The second scenario is the attacking force is worse than the way things are. So now there's a matter of degree there. Are they just going to be slightly worse? Is it just going to be slightly annoying? In which case, your willingness to resist their attack is only going to go. It's going to be proportional. The more terrible they are, the more likely there is to be an assault. Now, if The extreme would be an assault that basically you have a reasonable expectation that they're going to murder you and everybody else, which there have been invading armies that are essentially like that. The Chigasids, for instance, or Tamerlane. And what happened to some of the Native Americans on occasions, they could reasonably expect that they'd all be slaughtered. In those cases, there is no prisoner's dilemma. There is no, I'll collaborate, because you know as a collaborator, you're still going to be put to death or have a high enough likelihood of being put to death that it doesn't make a lot of sense, and you resist. This is the you've got nothing to lose attitude, and this is actually pretty common. Now, let's say that they're not that likely to kill you, but it's still a very, very bad thing. Then there's still a very strong incentive to resist. It is better to resist than live under something that's considerably worse, which is what the collaboration, at best,